I've never been good at talking about this, but here goes nothing. A few years back, I was in a rough spot financially. Desperation leads you to strange places, and in my case, that meant taking a job as a night guard at an old, isolated lighthouse. At first, it felt like a stroke of luck. Who wouldn't want to get away from everything, right? No people, no noise, just the sea and the wind. It seemed perfect. But that place, it's different. Not just old or spooky, but like it had secrets buried deep in its bones. The lighthouse stood on this jagged stretch of coast, miles away from the nearest village. Everything about it felt ancient. Creaky wooden stairs, rusting metal fittings, and those huge, analog dials I had to monitor. The light itself moved slowly, sweeping across the black ocean like some giant, searching eye. Nights there were long. The wind howled through the walls, making the whole structure shudder. Alone in that tower, I'd sometimes swear the place was breathing. The only connection I had to the outside world was an old radio linked to the coastal base. Most nights, it was just static and occasional check-ins. But that first night, it was just me, the endless crashing of waves, and the wind whispering through cracks I couldn't see. As the days blended into each other, the isolation started to feel heavier. The sounds of the sea, which I thought would be calming, became oppressive. Every wave that crashed against the rocks sounded louder at night, amplified by the wind that never seemed to stop. But then, I began hearing something else, something beneath the usual roar of the ocean. It wasn't just the waves anymore. It was like a distant, mournful wail, almost human but twisted. At first, I brushed it off. The mind plays tricks, especially in a place like that. But the sound stuck with me, like an itch I couldn't scratch, growing clearer and closer each night. One evening, during my usual patrol, I decided to step outside and check the rocks below. The wind was brutal, almost knocking me off my feet, but I had to know. What I saw made my stomach drop. There were deep grooves carved into the rocks, like something massive had scraped across them. They weren't natural, and they definitely weren't made by any tools I knew of. They ran in patterns almost like claw marks, but too deep, too precise. I tried telling myself it was just the wind and waves eroding the stone, but deep down, I knew better. That night, I couldn't shake the unease. I kept telling myself it was just isolation messing with my head, but every creak and groan of the lighthouse felt amplified. The wailing sound returned, stronger this time, almost rhythmic, like a distorted chant carried on the wind. It felt like it was calling out, and for a second, I caught myself leaning closer to the window, trying to hear it better. That's when I saw something, a shadow, or maybe a silhouette, moving in the water. It was brief, barely a glimpse before it vanished beneath the waves, but it was huge. Way too big to be any animal I knew. I tried to radio the base to report it, but all I got was static. Not unusual with the storms out there, but then the static shifted. Mixed in with the crackling noise were faint whispers. I couldn't make out words, but it was unmistakably human. Voices overlapping, fading in and out. I leaned closer to the receiver, and for a second, I thought I heard my own name. My blood ran cold. I slammed the radio off and tried to convince myself it was just interference. But as I turned away, I noticed something even worse. Wet footprints leading up the stairs to the lantern room. I hadn't been up there since my shift started, and the door had been locked. I stood frozen, staring at those footprints. They were too large and oddly shaped, with wide gaps between each toe, almost like they were made by something not quite human. My first instinct was to check if someone had broken in, but the door to the lantern room was still locked. With my flashlight trembling in my hand, I forced myself up the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound echoing through the tower like a warning. When I reached the top, the room was empty, but the air felt wrong. Heavy, damp, like something had been there and left behind a presence. The light continued its slow rotation, casting long shadows that seemed to move just a little too much. I checked the door and windows, still locked from the inside. But there was a smell, faint but unmistakable, like salt water mixed with something rotting. I couldn't find a source, and the footprints vanished near the lantern mechanism. My mind was racing. Maybe I was losing it. Isolation does that, right? I tried to laugh it off, but the sound died in my throat when I saw something through the glass. Down on the rocks, in the narrow beam of light, something was moving. Several figures, pale and hunched, were climbing the rocks, their movements jerky, almost broken. The light passed, and they disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. I wanted to believe it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I backed away from the glass, heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I kept telling myself I hadn't seen anything, that it was just the wind playing tricks with the waves. But then the light swept around again, and I saw them clearer this time. Shapes, definitely humanoid, clinging to the rocks as if they were crawling out of the sea. Their skin glistened under the beam, pale and slick, like it was covered in a thin layer of slime. And their eyes, I swear, they reflected the light back, glowing for a split second before the darkness swallowed them again. I stumbled back down the stairs, my flashlight barely cutting through the shadows. The lighthouse felt alive, every groan of the metal and would like a breath. I tried to radio the base again, but the static had returned, louder, almost angry. The whispers were clearer now, layered and overlapping, speaking words I couldn't understand. And then, just as I was about to give up, one phrase came through, clear as day, "They're coming." My blood ran cold. I dropped the receiver, the crackling static echoing through the room. I couldn't think straight. My mind kept racing back to those words, "They're coming." I wanted to get out of there, but where would I go? The only way out was down the narrow path that led to the cliffside, and the thought of those things waiting in the dark made my skin crawl. My only option was to stay put, lock everything down, and hope whatever was out there couldn't get in. I ran through the tower, checking doors, locking windows, my heart pounding with every creak of the old structure. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The wind howled louder, almost like it was carrying voices with it. Then the pounding started. At first, I thought it was just the wind slamming something against the walls, but it grew louder and more deliberate. Heavy rhythmic thuds, like something huge was trying to break through the base of the lighthouse. I crept to a window and peered down. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on the rocks below. They were there, figures now closer, clambering up the rocks with an unnatural, jerky motion. One of them looked up, and for a split second, our eyes met. Its face was all wrong, pale, scaly skin stretched too tight over sharp, angular features. Its mouth opened, and even over the wind, I heard that wailing sound like a chorus of distorted screams. I stumbled back from the window, heart hammering in my chest. That thing's eyes, black, hollow like deep wells, were burned into my mind. The pounding grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't random anymore. It was a rhythm, like a signal. The whole structure seemed to vibrate with each hit, the metal groaning, as if it was about to give way. I ran to the lantern room, thinking maybe the height would give me some kind of advantage, some way to see how many there were. But halfway up the stairs, the smell hit me again, salt and rot, so strong I gagged. It felt like the walls were closing in, every creak and groan amplified, like the lighthouse itself was in on it. When I finally made it to the top, I saw them. They were closer, some already on the ledge, clinging to the rocks like they belonged there. Their pale, slick bodies glistened in the sweeping light, their movements unnatural and jerky. One of them reached the window and pressed a webbed hand against the glass, leaving a wet smear behind. Its mouth moved, but the sound that came out wasn't human. It was a mix of whispers and screams, layered and distorted, the same sound I'd heard on the radio. The light passed over them again, and for a moment, I saw dozens, maybe more, moving up the rocks, their eyes glowing like tiny, distant beacons. I couldn't breathe. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything except the rhythmic thuds echoing through the tower. My hands were slick with sweat as I gripped the railing, trying to steady myself. The creatures outside were getting closer, their distorted forms illuminated by each slow sweep of the light. The one at the window dragged its hand down the glass, leaving streaks of water that seemed to pulse and shimmer in the light. Its mouth opened again, that horrible sound rising like a wave, and for a second, I thought I saw its lips form words, but they were wrong, twisted, like the language of something ancient and forgotten. I stumbled back, my mind racing. There had to be a way to stop them, to keep them out. Then I remembered the old logbooks in the control room. I'd glanced at them once, thinking they were just records of routine maintenance and weather patterns. But there was something else, something about the things that come from the sea. I tore through the papers, my hands shaking. And there it was, a journal entry, barely legible, from a guard who'd worked here decades ago. He wrote about an artifact hidden in the base of the lighthouse, something that the creatures were drawn to, something that had to be kept away from the sea at all costs. My blood ran cold. I had to find it. I raced down the stairs, each step echoing like a drumbeat, each creak of the old wood making my nerves jolt. The pounding outside grew louder, more urgent, as if the creatures knew I was getting closer to something they wanted. My flashlight flickered, casting long, jagged shadows along the walls. The smell of salt and decay was everywhere now, like the sea itself had seeped into the tower. I reached the base, where a rusty, locked metal door hid the storage room. Kicking through it wasn't an option. The lock was too thick, and my hands were shaking too much to force it open. In a panic, I searched for anything that could help, finally spotting a crowbar leaning against the wall. I jammed it into the lock, the metal screeching as I pried it open. Inside, the room was small and cluttered, filled with old equipment and crates covered in decades of dust. In the corner, half buried under some tarps, I found it, the artifact. It looked like a piece of coral, but it pulsed with a faint, eerie glow, almost like it was breathing. The second I touched it, a low hum filled the room, vibrating through my bones. The pounding outside the lighthouse stopped, just for a moment, replaced by an eerie, expectant silence. That silence was worse than the pounding. It was like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something. The artifact felt warm in my hands, almost alive, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to match my heartbeat. I didn't know what to do, but every instinct screamed that I needed to get rid of it. I ran back up the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet. The wind outside howled louder than ever, rattling the windows, as if the entire lighthouse was about to be torn apart. When I reached the lantern room, the creatures were closer, some climbing the outer walls, others pressing their faces against the glass, their mouths moving in that horrible, silent chant. Their eyes glowed, fixed on the artifact in my hands. I knew I had to throw it back into the sea, but every step toward the window felt like walking through molasses. It was as if the lighthouse itself was fighting me. I forced the window open, the wind almost ripping it out of my hands. Below, the sea churned violently, waves crashing against the rocks, as if the ocean was alive and angry. With a final, desperate breath, I hurled the artifact into the dark water. The moment the artifact hit the water, everything changed. The wind stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. The creatures froze, their glowing eyes fixed on the spot where it had disappeared beneath the waves. For a few heartbeats, the only sound was the distant crash of the surf. Then, one by one, they began to retreat. They slipped back down the rocks, their movements even more unnatural in reverse, as if rewinding a nightmare. The ones clinging to the lighthouse walls peeled away, sliding back into the shadows. Within moments, they were gone, swallowed by the dark sea. I collapsed against the wall, my legs unable to hold me. My mind struggled to process what had just happened. The silence was oppressive, almost deafening after the chaos. I tried to convince myself it was over, but deep down I knew better. When I looked out at the sea, the waves were still, almost too still, like they were waiting. I stumbled back down to the control room, desperate to call the base. The radio crackled to life, the static gone. But as I lifted the receiver, I saw something out the window, deep grooves, bigger than before, etched into the rocks. The ground beneath the lighthouse seemed lower, like it had been pulled down, just a little, into the sea. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe the storm had shifted the rocks, or maybe the lighthouse had always leaned like that, and I just hadn't noticed. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something had changed. I grabbed the radio, my hands still trembling, and called the base. This time, the signal was clear, but all I got was the usual check-in. I couldn't bring myself to tell them what had happened. How could I? I barely understood it myself. I just muttered that everything was fine, even though every part of me screamed that it wasn't. As dawn broke, the light outside seemed different, muted, almost like the world was holding its breath. I went out to inspect the rocks, hoping to find some logical explanation, something that would make all of this make sense. The grooves were deeper, wider, stretching out toward the sea like giant claw marks. But what really got me was the water. It was lower, like the ocean had receded, leaving behind a stretch of slick, black rocks that hadn't been exposed before. And on those rocks there were symbols, patterns that looked ancient, carved deep into the stone, as if they'd been there for centuries, waiting to be uncovered. I couldn't tear my eyes away from those symbols. They looked almost like writing, but not in any language I'd ever seen. Jagged lines and spirals, etched with a precision that felt deliberate, ancient. My gut twisted. This wasn't erosion or some natural phenomenon. Whatever had been buried beneath those waves had been there a long time, and now it was waking up. I backed away, the salt air feeling thicker, heavier. The lighthouse, the rocks, the ocean, it all felt wrong, like I was standing on the edge of something I wasn't supposed to see. As I turned to head back inside, I noticed something else. Footprints. Not mine. They led from the water's edge to the base of the lighthouse, those same wide, webbed prints I'd seen on the stairs. They were fresh, glistening in the weak morning light. My heart started pounding again, the fear crawling back up my spine. I followed the trail, half expecting to see one of those things waiting for me. But the print stopped at the door, and the door was wide open. I know I locked it. I know I did. I stepped inside, every instinct telling me to run, but I couldn't. The lighthouse felt different, like it was holding its breath. The air was thick, the silence pressing down on me. The door slammed shut behind me, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. My flashlight flickered as I moved through the narrow hallway. I could hear something, faint, almost like a whisper, coming from the top of the stairs. My own footsteps sounded too loud, like the place was amplifying every sound, waiting for something. When I reached the lantern room, it was empty. Or so I thought. The floor was wet, small puddles leading to the window. And then I saw it. Something had been scratched into the glass, deep and jagged. Not words, just symbols, the same ones I'd seen on the rocks. My breath caught. I turned, and for a moment, I swore I saw a shadow move in the corner just out of the light. I swung my flashlight around, but there was nothing there. The whispering grew louder, filling the room. It wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was inside. I spun around, flashlight shaking, but the room was empty. The whispering grew louder, layered, like voices overlapping from all directions. It was as if the walls were breathing, vibrating with that awful sound. My eyes darted to the symbols scratched into the glass. New ones had appeared, deeper, almost glowing in the faint morning light. My head throbbed, and it felt like those whispers were inside my skull, drilling into my thoughts. I staggered back, my hands covering my ears, but it didn't help. Then I noticed something in the reflection of the glass. At first, I thought it was just the light playing tricks again, but no, the reflection showed something that wasn't there. One of those creatures, standing right behind me, its skin glistening, eyes fixed on mine. I spun around, but there was nothing. I could feel it though, that cold presence, like the room had grown smaller, the air pressed against my skin. The symbols seemed to pulse, and the whispers turned into a low, rhythmic chant, matching the beating of my heart. I couldn't stay there. I bolted for the stairs, not even looking back. I raced down the stairs, the whispers echoing in my ears, growing louder with every step. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching and twisting like they were alive. When I reached the bottom, I slammed the door shut behind me, my breath ragged. But the whispering didn't stop. It felt like it was inside me now, vibrating through my bones. I stumbled into the control room, desperate to get out, to escape whatever was happening. But when I looked out the window, the ocean had changed. The waves were still, too still, and the water was darker than before, almost black, like ink spreading out from the shore. Then the ground trembled. Not a big quake, just a deep, low rumble that seemed to come from beneath the lighthouse. I looked down at the floor, and for a moment, I swore it was sinking inch by inch. My mind raced back to the journal, to the warning. They always come back. I didn't know what the artifact was or why they wanted it, but throwing it into the sea hadn't stopped them. It had only woken something up. Something bigger. Something older. The tremor stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It was heavy, almost oppressive, like the whole world was holding its breath. I glanced around, heart pounding, expecting to see those pale figures pressing against the windows again. But there was nothing. Just the empty room, the hum of the old equipment, and the distant, rhythmic crash of the waves, too steady, too deliberate. I grabbed the radio, desperate for any connection to the outside world. Static. But beneath it, something else. Faint. A low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the rocks. Then a voice crackled through the static. My voice. It took a second to register, but there was no mistaking it. Words I hadn't spoken, twisted and distorted. You shouldn't have touched it. The blood drained from my face. I dropped the receiver, the whispers returning, louder, layered, like the lighthouse was full of voices. I backed away, but the floor seemed to tilt, the walls narrowing. The symbols from the rocks, the ones etched into the glass, now faintly glowed on the walls and floor, like the whole structure was part of some larger thing. Something I couldn't escape. I stumbled back, the room spinning, the glow from the symbols intensifying. They pulsed in time with my heartbeat, or maybe it was the other way around. The whispers were everywhere now, inside and outside, as if the lighthouse itself had become a part of them. I knew I had to get out. Whatever I'd set in motion couldn't be stopped, but maybe I could escape it. I grabbed my jacket, my flashlight, and threw open the door to the outside. The wind hit me like a wall, but it wasn't the same. It carried that same deep, rhythmic hum, like the whole world was vibrating. I ran down the narrow path, slipping on the wet rocks, the sound of the ocean growing louder and stranger. I I risked a glance back at the lighthouse. It looked different, the light flickering erratically, the entire structure seeming to bend, almost like it was being pulled down into the earth. And then I saw them again, those figures, pale and slick, emerging from the water. Dozens of them now, maybe more. They moved in unison, their eyes fixed on me. I turned and ran, but the ground beneath my feet felt soft, unstable, like it was sinking. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was that voice, my voice, whispering, "It's too late." When I came to, everything was silent. The sky had that eerie, pre-dawn glow, but something was off. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of salt and decay. I sat up, my head pounding, and looked around. The lighthouse was gone. Not destroyed, just gone. In its place, a jagged hole, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed it. The ground where it stood was slick, wet, covered in those same symbols I'd seen on the rocks. They pulsed faintly, almost like they were breathing. I stumbled to the edge, looking down into the black water below. It was impossibly still, like a mirror. The creatures were gone, the whispers silenced. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over. But then I noticed the tide. It wasn't coming in or going out, it was just waiting. And in that perfect stillness, I realized the truth. Whatever I'd thrown back into the sea hadn't stopped anything. It had just delayed it. I don't know what that artifact was or why the lighthouse was built to guard it, but something ancient had been disturbed, and it wasn't finished. As I stood there, staring at the dark water, I saw something move beneath the surface. Just a ripple, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Watching. Waiting. I remembered the final words in that old journal. They always come back. And now I know whatever they are, they're not done.